If you found yourself suddenly thrust into the heart of the American Wild West sometime around the 1870s, believing your modern instincts and TV-learned swagger would help you navigate the dangers of frontier life, you'd very likely not last beyond a single sunrise, and the reasons are as numerous and unforgiving as the dust blowing across the Great Plains. The first and most immediate challenge would be the climate and geography, which offered no grace and even less forgiveness. Dry winds whipped mercilessly across desert landscapes, scorching sun would blister your skin by midday, and nighttime temperatures would plunge drastically, leaving the unprepared shivering in threadbare blankets or worse, exposed under open skies, vulnerable to biting insects, predators and disease. Imagine walking through the high desert plains with no paved roads, no cell phone, no GPS, and no clean water, trying to orient yourself with only the vague advice of an old-timer telling you to follow the sun to the river, when that river might be 40 miles away and bone dry this season. Your boots, if you were lucky to have a pair suited for rugged terrain, would chafe and blister your feet within hours, and you'd quickly discover how every mile felt longer when the only company you had was the ceaseless hum of cicadas and the distant, eerie cries of coyotes that watched from afar. But let's say you did survive the first few hours and stumbled your way into a town, dusty and sunburned, clinging to your wallet and dignity, hoping to find shelter and perhaps a glass of water. You'd quickly be disabused of any romantic notions you had about saloons and gentleman cowboys when you pushed open the back wing doors and stepped into a room thick with cigar smoke, sour whiskey breath, and the low growl of suspicious men who didn't take kindly to outsiders, especially those who looked soft, clean, or wore the wrong hat. One wrong glance or an out-of-place word could be mistaken for a challenge, and men who'd spent years fighting in the Civil War, wrangling cattle, or riding with outlaw gangs had hair-trigger tempers and faster guns, though they preferred fists and boots in bar fights that often ended with a bloodied scalp and no lawman in sight. Speaking of lawmen, don't expect the sheriff to be much help if trouble found you. Most towns had one, maybe two lawmen, if you were lucky, and they were often outgunned, underpaid, and either corrupt or too tired to bother breaking up another fight between two drunken ranch hands. If you weren't shot or stabbed in the bar, you might be fleeced by a conman or card sharp at the poker table, because gambling was as much a staple of life as beans and cornbread, and you can bet they'd spot your modern ignorance within seconds, your tells, your hesitation, your clean hands, marking you for easy prey. But let's imagine you managed to avoid conflict for the day and wandered out of town in search of honest work. You'd find there was no real safety outside the city limits either. The moment you left the relative shelter of town, you were alone in a violent, lawless expanse of territory teeming with bandits, rustlers, and even worse, loneliness, hunger, and despair. Cattle drives, for instance, were romanticized in dime novels, but the reality was weeks of brutal labor in scorching heat, eating salt pork and beans, drinking from contaminated streams, and sleeping with your boots on to avoid waking up to a rattlesnake curling into your blanket. Every noise at night sent a chill through your bones because it could be anything, a stampede, a wolf, or a Comanche war party, still fiercely resisting US encroachment and known to move swiftly and silently through the plains with terrifying efficiency. You'd quickly learn that most white settlers lived in a constant state of fear, of native attacks, of livestock theft, of disease, of fire, and of each other. Medical care? Forget it. If you caught cholera from drinking bad water, dysentery from spoiled food, or tetanus from a rusty nail, you might be dead in 2 days, and all the doctor could offer was laudanum or whiskey, and maybe an amputation with no anesthesia except biting down on a leather strap while you screamed. Women didn't fare any better. In fact, life was often crueler for them, especially those who ended up in brothels or married off to brutal husbands far from family and hygiene. It didn't exist in the way you know it. Most people bathed once a month if they were lucky, outhouses were shared, and lice were so common that shaving your head wasn't seen as strange, it was practical. If you were lucky enough to land a job as a ranch hand, you'd work from dawn to dusk in back-breaking labor for $1 a day, sleeping in a barn or under the stars, eating whatever you could catch or buy with your meager pay. Farming wasn't better. Homesteaders spent their lives breaking unforgiving soil, battling locusts, prairie fires, drought, and floods, often buried in shallow graves next to the same cabin they'd built in hope, but died in despair. Every season brought a new plague, grasshoppers eating your entire crop in hours, flash floods destroying your barn, or snowstorms trapping you in for weeks with no food but stale flour and beans. But let's say you had a skill. Maybe you thought being a blacksmith, a teacher, or a clerk would give you safety and stability. Even those roles were filled with daily dangers. A blacksmith inhaled soot and fumes, often lost fingers or eyes, and worked in searing heat year-round. Teachers were poorly paid, had to discipline rough frontier children with no support, and often had to sleep in the same building they taught in, sometimes doubling as community nurses or undertakers. Clerks, meanwhile, were frequent targets of robbers, especially stagecoach clerks or those managing bank safes. Banks themselves were rarely secure, and the mention of names like Jesse James or the Dalton Gang struck terror because they didn't just rob, they killed. If you were on a train, don't assume safety either. Train robberies were common, especially in territories like New Mexico, Kansas, or Arizona, where gangs would force the conductor to stop, loot passengers, and shoot anyone who resisted. Mail delivery? Carried by brave but short-lived riders of the Pony Express or mail coaches, who often ended up ambushed and looted in remote canyons. And through all of this, you'd never truly know who you could trust. The man offering you a drink might be planning to rob you. The woman smiling at you in the saloon might be working for the house or scouting you for a gang. Even your bunkmate at the cattle ranch might slit your throat for a few silver coins if he thought he wouldn't get caught. Justice was fast, brutal, and often mob-based. Lynchings were common, and trials were rare. If you were accused, even falsely, of stealing a horse, a capital crime, you might find yourself strung up from a cottonwood before you could speak a word in your defense. Horses, by the way, were essential to survival, and if you didn't know how to ride, tack, feed, and defend your mount, you might as well not bother living west of the Mississippi. A man without a horse in the Wild West was often as good as dead, stranded and helpless in a vast, uncaring landscape. And even if you managed to find a horse, a gun, and a job, the mental toll would wear you down fast. Constant danger, loneliness, poor food, harsh weather, and the ever-present threat of death by violence, disease, or accident would grind you down. There were no therapists, no weekends off, no government safety nets. Every decision mattered. Every mistake could be your last. You'd be thousands of miles from the world you know, and every assumption about comfort, law, decency, trust would betray you. You'd realize that the Wild West wasn't wild because it was free. It was wild because it was brutal, chaotic, merciless, and utterly indifferent to your survival. If by some rare twist of fate you did not perish within those early hours or days in the American frontier, it would only be because you'd adapted rapidly or sheer dumb luck carried you through, though the latter wouldn't last long. You'd soon discover that the sound of silence was not peaceful but oppressive, filled with distant echoes of dangers too subtle to see. A creek gurgling too loudly might mask the sound of a stalking cougar. A friendly stranger who rode beside you on the trail might turn out to be an outlaw waiting to shoot you in the back and steal your boots. You'd begin to understand that everyone in the West had a past, most of them violent, and many had left something behind, whether it was a dead man, a family, a war, or a prison cell. You couldn't ask too many questions without raising suspicions. Politeness might save you, but so might a deliberate show of coldness. If you appeared too friendly, you'd be taken for a swindler or fool. If you acted too tough, someone would call your bluff just to see if they could break you. And they usually would, because the people who lived in the West had been hardened by things most modern people can scarcely imagine: watching their parents slaughtered in a wagon train ambush, burying half their children before the age of 5, or surviving winters so cold they had to eat shoe leather boiled into stew. The constant undercurrent of violence wasn't just external, it seeped into how people spoke, moved, and even sat. You'd notice men sitting with their backs to walls, eyes darting to the door whenever it opened. Women walked swiftly, deliberately, knowing too well what the wrong smile could provoke in a world where justice often favored the powerful and the armed. And while movies romanticize the West as a place of galloping horses and righteous shootouts, most people didn't die in epic duels at high noon. They died from infected wounds, from falling off horses, from barbed wire entanglements, or being dragged to death by runaway wagons. Even a simple chore like chopping wood could end in disaster if your axe slipped. A fever was enough to kill you. Childbirth was a death sentence for many women. Children were rarely raised by both parents. Death was too common. You'd see graveyards with markers reading unknown, or lost in blizzard, or died of grief. And should you try to earn a living by some entrepreneurial means like mining, you'd be signing up for a life shorter than that of a dog. Mining towns sprang up overnight and died just as fast, filled with hopeful fools who believed they'd strike it rich with a pan and a prayer. What you'd actually find was claustrophobic shafts hundreds of feet deep, where cave-ins were constant, air was thin, and men fought like animals over gold flakes the size of fingernails. You'd live in a tent or a mud-floored shack beside hundreds of other desperate men, bathing rarely and eating worse. Food was often maggot-ridden, bread baked with sawdust or spoiled flour, and meat preserved with questionable methods. Scurvy would rot your gums if you couldn't get citrus, which you wouldn't. Your hands would split and bleed from the pickaxe, and you'd probably die coughing up blood from silicosis before ever finding anything of value. And even if you did strike gold, there was no guarantee you'd live to spend it. Claim jumpers, corrupt marshals, or jealous neighbors would kill you in your sleep or rig your meal with poison. The law rarely sided with justice, and often with whoever paid more, and the courts were slow, biased, and nearly useless. In many places, vigilante justice ruled the day. Towns might have a local committee of self-appointed protectors who decided the fate of accused criminals without a trial, hanging them from trees at midnight, and daring anyone to speak against it. And if you think you'd find justice for a crime committed against you, good luck. A traveller from the East, especially one who looked educated or soft, would often be the first suspected of anything strange. Locals stuck together. Outsiders were expendable. You wouldn't have the social networks, family ties, or even language skills. Many areas were dominated by Mexican, Chinese, German, or Scandinavian communities, with tight internal cultures and long memories. Trying your luck as a cowboy might seem like a decent way to earn your keep, but it was an existence as bleak and back-breaking as any. You'd spend weeks in the saddle driving cattle across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain, constantly alert for rustlers, stampedes, or bad weather that could kill entire herds overnight. Your diet would consist mostly of beans, dried biscuits, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. You'd sleep on the hard ground, in rain or wind or heat, with your saddle as your pillow and a revolver under your arm. Bathing was rare. and lice were inevitable. Your co-workers might be former Confederate soldiers, ex-slaves, Mexican vaqueros, or teenagers with nothing to lose. Fights broke out constantly, over cards, over women, over pride, and you'd quickly learn that breaking up a brawl could get you stabbed. Accidents happened daily. Horses stumbled and rolled over men, stampedes trampled them, water crossings drowned them. If you didn't die on the job, your body would still be wrecked by 40, wrists shattered from roping, knees ruined by years in the saddle, lungs filled with dust and trail fire smoke. And there were no pensions, no doctors, no rest homes. A broken man went to the edge of town and died in silence, or tried to end it in a bottle of rot-gut whiskey that could blind you if made poorly, and most of it was let quotes say you were educated and decided to open a small mercantile store, hoping to provide goods to travelers and settlers. That too came with its own set of dangers. Supply lines were fragile and long. Bandits could rob your wagons, storms could destroy your goods, and dishonest customers might run a tab they'd never repay. Worse still, your store could be a target during town riots, or be ransacked during a raid. And in some areas, racial tensions ran high. Chinese laborers faced violence and expulsion. Native Americans were routinely massacred or driven from land they'd lived on for centuries, and Mexican settlers were often branded as thieves or savages, regardless of their character. If you belonged to any marginalized group, your odds of survival were even lower. You could be lynched for looking at the wrong person the wrong way, and justice was rarely served for those who didn't fit into the Anglo-American frontier image. Even churches offered little shelter. Priests were sometimes armed, and sermons were often cut short by gunshots outside the door. Sunday wasn't a day of peace. It was when the town filled up, and with the crowd came conflict. Dueling was still semi-legal in many places, and men carried their pistols not for show, but necessity. Even the children learned to shoot by the age of 10. Boys were expected to grow into killers. Girls were expected to marry them. No one dreamed of peace. They dreamed of survival, and if you tried to leave, say, book passage on a stagecoach to a quieter town, you'd still face dangers beyond imagination. Stagecoaches were slow, noisy, and easy targets for road agents. You'd be crammed with strangers in a wooden box bouncing over rock and river for hundreds of miles, eating dust and sharing space with chickens, crying babies, and armed guards who might not even stay awake. The wheels broke, axles snapped, horses spooked. You could be thrown, trampled, or left behind if you slowed the team. Then there was the threat of native resistance. Many tribes were still at war, or had been driven to the brink by broken treaties, starvation, and mass slaughter. Raids on travelers were not uncommon, and while some tribes took prisoners, others killed or scalped anyone they saw as invaders. And to them, rightly so, you were an invader. The West was built on blood, of settlers, of soldiers, of indigenous families torn from their homelands. The myth of the noble pioneer masks the genocide and suffering beneath. You would see entire native villages burned, women and children slaughtered in government-sanctioned raids, while survivors were herded onto barren reservations. If you had a conscience, it would ache constantly. If you didn't, you'd fit right in with the rest of the killers. The reality is that the Wild West wasn't a place of freedom, it was a place of desperation. People didn't go west to find a better life. They went because they had no life left elsewhere. Escaped convicts, bankrupt farmers, widows, orphans, war veterans too broken to reintegrate. These were your neighbors. The land didn't promise prosperity. It offered only the chance to survive if you were strong, brutal, or lucky, and the land fought back. Fire swept across the plains. Droughts lasted for years. Blizzards buried entire settlements. Locusts blacked out the sky. Wolves prowled the hills. Bears stalked the woods. The West didn't want you. It tested you every day. It asked whether you were hard enough, smart enough, cold enough to keep living, and if you weren't, it buried you. No gravestone, no mourning, just dust and silence and another nameless hill among millions. And so, with all your modern expectations, your tender comforts, your love of air conditioning and plumbing and dental care, your respect for police and belief in laws, your assumption that help is just a phone call away, you wouldn't last. Not a week, not a day, maybe not even an hour. The Wild West chewed men like you up and spit their bones across the desert. And if somehow, some unfathomable miracle, you survived that first brutal sunrise, it would not be because you tamed the West, it would be because you were lucky enough to be ignored by it. And yet if you endured past that first hour and managed to last into your second day, you would have already lost much of yourself, your illusions, your certainty, your sense of control. The frontier would have chipped at your mind like wind over sandstone, wearing away the smug confidence you once carried like armor, leaving behind something raw and more exposed. You might start to notice how the people around you never looked fully at peace, how their eyes remained sharp with suspicion, constantly flicking to assess their surroundings, how no one ever laughed too loud unless they were drunk. And even then there was a hitch in it, as if the sound itself might summon trouble. In town the buildings were mostly wood and hastily constructed, leaning in odd directions, with warped floors and walls so thin you could hear rats scratching through the grain sacks in the next room. Every business operated with one eye on the door and one hand on a weapon. The post office clerk might be missing a hand, blown off during a failed robbery. The undertaker's shop, often the busiest business in town, might display coffins in all sizes, even small ones, because child death was so commonplace it barely drew attention, and still the town would seem alive compared to the vast silence that awaited beyond its dusty streets. If you had to ride out into that land, to deliver a message, to fetch water, to find a stray cow, you'd quickly feel how truly alone you were. No power lines, no radio towers, no fences even, just endless miles of emptiness that felt less like freedom and more like a threat, as if the land itself were warning you that you didn't belong here. The animals knew how to survive, the rattlesnake, the vulture, the scorpion, but you didn't. The terrain offered no landmarks, the sun offered no mercy, and the wind carried with it the scent of dead things more often than not. You might find shelter in a small homestead, one of the isolated cabins carved into the wilderness by stubborn families trying to stake a claim under the Homestead Act, which promised land to any who could work it for 5 years. But what the law didn't explain was how many of those years would be spent watching crops fail, watching children cough blood into their handkerchiefs, watching wolves circle the livestock pen, and wondering if the rifle on the mantle would be used on strangers or on yourself. Many settlers wrote letters home describing the unbearable isolation. No doctors, no neighbors for miles, just you and the wind and the wolves. Cabin fever was real and deadly. Men went mad during blizzards and burned down their own homes. Women went blind from malnutrition or killed their babies when they ran out of milk. The soil itself was often useless, rocky, alkaline, uncooperative. Wells had to be dug by hand, sometimes over 100 feet, and even then the water could be foul with sulfur or salt. You'd try to grow corn and end up with scrub. You'd try to raise cattle and lose half to disease or rustlers. You'd understand why so many gave up and moved back east, assuming they weren't already buried in the West. Then there was the ever-present spectre of war, which the West never really shook. The Civil War might have ended in 1865, but its consequences stretched into every territory, town, and household. Former Confederates moved west to escape Union control. bringing their grudges and guns. Union veterans did the same. Skirmishes erupted between men who still wore fragments of their old uniforms. Outlaws often were war veterans turned rogue, trained in guerrilla tactics and utterly desensitized to bloodshed. Jesse James and his gang were Confederate partisans before they were bank robbers. Others, like William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson, left a legacy of raids and massacres that shaped the region's fears for decades. You'd hear about whole towns burned in border conflicts. You'd meet survivors with mutilated limbs, disfigured faces and eyes that had seen too much. And beyond that, the so-called Indian Wars raged on. Treaties were signed and broken with appalling regularity. Entire tribes were relocated, starved, massacred, or forced into barren corners of land labeled reservations. The Dakota Uprising, the Sand Creek Massacre, the Battle of Little Bighorn, each marked a moment of brutality that scarred the earth and stained the consciences of the men who fought in them. Whether you sided with the settlers or the tribes, the truth was always soaked in blood. As a modern person, you'd be torn between sympathy for the oppressed and terror at the retaliatory violence. You wouldn't know which side to trust. Both would see you as an outsider, and that was the most dangerous position of all. Even the wildlife was nothing like what you might have seen in documentaries or museums. Bison could crush a man under a ton of muscle and horn. Wolves hunted in coordinated packs and were far more cunning than you'd expect. Bears, especially grizzlies, were nearly bulletproof and could smell you from miles away. Mountain lions followed you silently and struck without warning. Even insects could kill. Mosquitoes carried malaria. Ticks carried Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Spiders nested in boots. And then there were the swarms, locusts that could black out the sky and strip entire fields of crops in hours. You could wake up to find your entire harvest eaten overnight, your livestock gone, your family starving, and when winter came, there was no warm escape, no central heating, no backup generators. You had your fire, your blankets, and whatever food you'd managed to preserve. If the firewood ran out, you'd burn your furniture. If the food ran out, you'd eat bark, or rats, or your horses. You'd see your neighbors reduced to skin and bone. You'd hear about cannibalism, whispered like a curse. The Donner Party wasn't an isolated story. Desperation repeated itself across the frontier. Every year someone froze to death with a full axe in their hand, too exhausted to chop one more log. You might survive the first freeze, maybe the second, but a third bad winter, you'd break like all the others, or starve. And if you thought salvation might come through faith, you'd find even religion was transformed by the harshness of the land. Traveling preachers moved from town to town, carrying Bibles in one hand and revolvers in the other. Churches were often just barns with a cross nailed above the door. Congregations were small, tense, desperate for hope, but afraid to dream. Sermons were often fire and brimstone, warning of hellfire and eternal damnation, and these words landed hard in a world that already felt like hell. Some settlers turned to strange sects or cult-like movements, desperate for divine intervention. Others gave up on faith entirely. The land had no miracles, and yet, day after day, people kept waking up and pushing forward, as if stubbornness alone could conquer the wilderness. They aged fast. A man of 30 might look 50. A woman of 40 might already be a grandmother, stooped and toothless, her hands ruined by years of scrubbing, hauling, and stitching. Children worked from the age of 5, gathering wood, feeding animals, carrying water. If they made it to adulthood, they'd already be familiar with death. They'd seen friends drown in rivers, sisters die of fever, cousins trampled by horses. They didn't cry anymore. There wasn't time. And while the West may have offered freedom from governments or taxes or crowded cities, it replaced those with tyranny of a different kind, the tyranny of the strong over the weak. The man with the biggest gang, the fastest draw, or the most ruthless instinct ruled. You'd find towns where the mayor was also the saloon keeper, the sheriff and the judge, and none of those roles offered justice, just power. Corruption was not the exception but the rule. Bribes, intimidation, vote buying, and outright murder shaped many local elections. Whistleblowers vanished, journalists were shot. Even territorial governors were often puppets of railroad companies or mining interests. You'd think twice before speaking your mind, and forget organized protest. The idea of workers' rights or civil liberties was a joke. If you struck for higher pay in a mine, you were blacklisted or shot. If you organized your fellow ranch hands, your employer might hang you and call it an accident. You'd realize that the land of the free was only free for those who could defend their claim with violence. And if you couldn't, well then you were just another name to be forgotten, another grave along the trail, another lost soul in a land that had no use for the weak, the kind or the modern. The Wild West did not care about your degree, your skills with a smartphone, your opinions on morality, your hopes for community. It crushed all of that beneath hooves, wheels, and rifle butts. It replaced civilization with raw survival, compassion with calculation, and history with blood. And that is why no matter how clever, brave or prepared you think you are, you would not survive a day in the Wild West, not truly, not fully, not without becoming something unrecognizable to yourself. And should you still be standing ragged and hollow-eyed, clinging to the fading hope that you could ride out the harshness of the West by sheer will or clever compromise, you would begin to face something more terrifying than gunfights or grizzly bears, the internal erosion of your own humanity. The West, by its very nature, didn't just test your body, it hollowed out your spirit, stripped you down until all that remained was a shell capable of reacting to violence, hunger, and fear with whatever instinct ensured your immediate survival. You'd find yourself beginning to bargain with parts of yourself you once believed sacred. You'd lie to a child to protect your ration of food. You'd cheat a dying man out of his horse because your own was lame and the next town was too far. You'd start carrying a pistol everywhere, not just for defense but because everyone else did, and you'd be lying to yourself if you said you weren't at least a little ready to use it. The first time you'd pull the trigger, it might be by accident, maybe a warning shot to scare off a rustler or a coyote, but the second time, it might not be. Maybe it would be a poker game gone wrong. Maybe you'd hear someone climbing through your window in the middle of the night. Maybe you wouldn't even see who you were shooting at. But the thing about killing in the West was that it rarely ended in triumph. It ended in silence. No police investigation, no therapist, just a body on the floor and a room full of people who'd either seen worse or didn't want to get involved. If you were lucky, someone would help you bury him. If not, you'd do it alone, trying not to look too closely at the blood soaking into the dry, cracked soil. You'd tell yourself it was justified. Everyone did. But something would shift inside you. The fear would settle deeper. The nerves would start to fray. You'd become jumpy, untrusting, half mad from the constant tension of trying to survive in a world where every sunrise was an unspoken dare, and every sunset a relief you didn't speak aloud for fear it might jinx you. You'd hear tales of gold found in the rivers of California, of new land waiting in Oregon, of cattle barons rising from nothing to fortunes, but you wouldn't see it. What you'd see were broken wagons scattered on the trails, with rusted spokes and torn canvas, sometimes still surrounded by the bones of oxen and men who didn't make it. You'd see crosses planted beside roads with nothing written on them because the dead had no names, just stories lost to the wind. You'd ride past towns that had dried up after the silver boom ended, ghost towns where buildings still stood but not a soul remained except the echoes. The ghosts were real, not in the sense of spirits but in the faces of people you'd meet along the way, men who hadn't spoken in weeks. Women with eyes that no longer reacted to light, Children who watched every adult as if judging whether they were safe or dangerous, though they'd already learned that most were the latter. And still you'd press on because that's what everyone did. No one stopped. Not really. You might hole up for a week to heal, to drink, to rest your horse, but the West was a current that never let you stand still. The moment you slowed, you were in danger of theft, of sickness, of being forgotten. The mail took weeks, if it arrived at all. Messages between families were often delivered by memory, recited aloud by a passing trader or preacher. News of war, of elections, of revolutions came late and always distorted, like light through dirty glass. You might hear Lincoln was president a year after he'd been assassinated. You might never hear of Garfield at all. Your world would shrink to whatever you could see, smell and shoot. And even in the rare moments of community, dances in the local hall, barn raisings, Sunday gatherings, you would never quite shake the unease. These brief islands of human warmth were never free from threat. A jealous husband might pick a fight over a glance. A drunk miner might mistake your smile for mockery. A girl might vanish, and everyone would know, but no one would say anything. The law wasn't there to protect you, it was there to keep the peace, and peace meant silence. You'd learn not to ask too many questions. You'd learn to bury what you saw. If you had family, you'd spend every moment guarding them, not just from the wilderness, but from neighbors. If you were alone, you'd learn to distrust everyone, even those who offered kindness. Because in the West, kindness often had a price. You'd carry everything you owned on your back or your horse. You'd sleep with one eye open. You'd eat food so bland or spoiled it no longer mattered what it was, only that it filled your stomach. Your health would decline, your teeth would rot, your skin would burn, crack and peel, your joints would ache. You'd wake up coughing, short of breath, wondering if the dust in your lungs would ever settle, and still the West would ask more of you. It would demand your grit, your sweat, your blood, and finally your sense of identity. Because the longer you stayed, the more you'd forget who you were. You'd forget what it felt like to hear music not played by a drunken fiddler or a broken piano. You'd forget the smell of clean linen, the sound of traffic, the ease of clean water flowing from a tap. You'd forget the softness of a bed that didn't creak with every movement or crawl with vermin. You'd forget how to speak without swearing, how to walk without glancing over your shoulder, how to live without a knife tucked into your boot. You'd forget that once, not long ago, you believed the world was moving toward kindness, comfort, and progress, and in that forgetting, you'd finally become something that could survive in the West. Not a hero, not a cowboy, but something harder, smaller, and meaner. Something unrecognizable, that more than any bullet or snake bite or starvation, is why you wouldn't survive a day in the Wild West. Not because you'd die immediately, but because surviving it would mean surrendering the parts of you that knew peace, that believed in fairness, that hoped for a better future. And once those parts were gone, the person you once were would be gone with them, buried not in a grave, but in the vast, relentless, unforgiving silence of the frontier. And if the days bled into weeks and you continued stumbling forward, hollowed yet still moving, it would no longer be the dangers you feared most, but the dull rhythm of enduring itself, the sameness of hardship, the sheer weight of trying to persist without breaking beneath it. You'd come to understand that no part of the West ever stopped demanding something from you, even in moments that appeared still, the slow drift of wind through dying prairie grass, the crackle of campfire coals in the dark, the distant cry of something unseen. You would never truly be at ease. You'd be waiting for a stranger to step from the shadows, for a snake to slither into your boot, for your last match to fizzle uselessly when you needed it most. You'd lose things steadily and irrevocably. A boot heel might snap, your hat could be stolen, your horse might step into a gopher hole and shatter its leg, and in the West, a man who lost his horse was a man whose hours were numbered. No one would lend you one unless they owed you blood, and no one owed anyone anything that couldn't be renegotiated with violence. And so you'd walk, blistering your feet to the bone, feeling the weight of every step as the vast distances reminded you that out here, nothing was close, nothing was guaranteed, and nothing was coming to save you. Towns were sometimes weeks apart, and in between were dry gullies, sun-baked flats, canyons choked with rattlesnakes, forests thick with silence, and hills where even the rocks seemed to be watching you. You'd drink muddy water filtered through a sock, chew on stale biscuit corners, and keep moving not because you had a destination, but because stopping meant death, whether from thirst, sunstroke, or the creeping paralysis of despair. Your reflection, if you caught it in a stream, would be a stranger, grimed, scarred, worn down by wind and days without sleep. Your eyes permanently squinting from sun exposure, your skin cracked like dried leather. But even if you managed to scavenge your way into another town, there was no assurance it would be better. Every town was its own kingdom, its own chaotic alignment of personalities and power struggles. One might be run by a former preacher turned despot, another by a gang who held the sheriff's badge like a trophy. You'd learn to read the air quickly, who nodded in greeting, who didn't, which saloon was for locals, which one for newcomers, which doors you didn't knock on unless you wanted to vanish. A dance hall girl might slip you a warning with her eyes, a shopkeeper might charge you double for not having the right accent, and every conversation came with subtext, a quiet assessment: is this man a threat, a fool or a target? No one was neutral, no one was without motive. The law, if it existed at all, was mostly a placeholder. A sheriff might be decent, but powerless. A judge might be learned, but crooked. Most conflicts were settled before dawn with pistols or fists behind barns, and every town had at least one stretch of land designated unofficially as Boot Hill, a cemetery for those who'd failed to guess wrong once. And if you asked too many questions or showed too much fear, it would be noticed. People remembered faces out west, not always kindly, and they didn't forgive easily, especially not strangers with strange ways. Your clothing, your voice, your hesitation would all betray you. You weren't born there, hadn't been raised with the instinct to ride hard, shoot straight, and lie convincingly. You didn't know the codes, the grudges, the blood debts. You'd try to keep your head down, maybe rent a room, maybe offer work in a shop, or help drive a wagon, anything to belong. But the West didn't care about your good intentions. It cared only whether you were useful, and even then only until someone more useful arrived. And if you stayed long enough in one place, long enough to start recognizing faces and falling into the slow routines of Western life, drawing water from the well, sweeping the dirt from the front of your door, checking your traps for rabbits, boiling coffee so thick it could peel rust, something in you would harden, not out of choice, but necessity, because you'd come to realize that every kindness carried risk. Every moment of peace was rented from fate. You'd stop asking names, you'd stop offering help, unless it was absolutely necessary. You'd watch, always watch. And when someone new arrived in town, someone cleaner, softer, with fresh boots and fresh eyes, you'd feel it rise in your chest. Pity, yes, but also judgment. They wouldn't make it. You'd know it. You'd see it in their hesitation, in the way they looked around expecting order, and you'd turn away, because if they died, there was nothing to do but keep living. The West had a way of washing over tragedy like rain over bone, smoothing, erasing, carrying it downstream until the land forgot, and only the memory of pain lingered in the ground itself. You'd bury enough people to know: men crushed by falling timber, women who hemorrhaged during childbirth, children who vanished after chasing a butterfly too far from home. Every loss would scar you a little more, but never enough to stop. The West didn't allow that. You couldn't stop. You couldn't weep too long. The chickens needed feeding, the fire needed wood, the rifle needed cleaning. Always something needed doing, and always the doing was what kept the grief from eating you alive. And there were moments, brief flickering moments, when the land seemed almost beautiful. When the sky turned blood red at dusk and you could hear nothing but wind, when the stars stretched wider than anything you'd ever imagined, when a deer crossed your path and paused just long enough to seem like a dream. In those moments you'd understand why people came, why they stayed, why they died here. Because the land itself wasn't cruel, it was indifferent, vast, unknowable. And in that indifference there was a kind of brutal purity. But purity didn't mean mercy. The West was beautiful the way fire is beautiful. You could admire it, but only from a distance and never for too long. You'd remember this the first time you got caught in a flash flood in a canyon, or when you found a traveler baked to death in the sun, mouth open, eyes dry as parchment. You'd remember it when you got snowed in for 4 days and had to burn your last spare pair of pants to keep the fire going. You'd remember it every time your hands shook from fever and no one was around to help. The beauty of the West was inseparable from its cruelty. It was not a land that gave easily, and when it did, it took something in return. And you, a modern soul, born to comfort, raised on screens and soft assurances, would finally come to see what had always been true, that you were not meant to survive here, not in body, not in spirit, not without becoming something else entirely. You could mimic the posture, wear the clothes, speak the lingo, but you couldn't erase what you'd been, and the land would know it. It always did. You'd see it in the eyes of the real survivors, men and women who had buried too many to count, who measured wealth not in dollars but in dry land and spare bullets, who had made peace with silence, with loss, with hunger. They wouldn't pity you. They wouldn't teach you unless there was something in it for them, because they knew what you didn't, that kindness was a currency too rare to be given freely. You'd come to understand this when you watched someone die slowly and realized there was nothing you could do but keep your own fire going. You'd feel it when you heard distant gunshots and didn't even rise to look. You'd carry it in your bones, the fatigue, the weather, the endless pressure of survival, and it would change you. Slowly, imperceptibly, day by day, the West would take from you until nothing soft remained, until there was no memory of comfort, only instinct. And in that moment, if you could somehow look at yourself with the eyes you once had, you wouldn't recognize the person staring back. You might still be breathing, walking, riding, eating, but surviving is not the same as living. And the West never cared about life, only about endurance, only about who could hold on the longest with the least. That is why you wouldn't survive a day in the Wild West, not because the bullet would find you fast, but because survival would cost you everything. And when it was done, you'd be just another shape hunched against the wind, faceless, wordless, buried beneath the same sun-bleached silence that swallowed all the others before you. And if you kept going by some cruel miracle of endurance or stubbornness so thick it bordered on madness, you would reach a point where even time began to lose its meaning. You'd stop counting the days, forget the names of months, forget what year it even was. There were no calendars nailed to saloon walls, no ticking clocks on nightstands, no steady rhythm to measure your life by, only the rise and fall of the sun and the long wait of the hours between. You'd measure time instead by the scars on your body, the tools broken and replaced, the graves dug, the friends lost, the bullets spent. Your hands would show more wear than your face, calloused, cracked, blistered, wrapped in dirty cloth, and black with dust that never truly washed out. You'd start to understand that cleanliness wasn't a virtue but a luxury, and the smell of sweat and blood and horse was the scent of every living man out here. Soap, when it could be found, was boiled from animal fat and ashes, and it stung when it touched the cuts on your skin. Baths were rare and cold and often shared. You'd see a man clean himself in a trough, look you in the eye, and say nothing, because what was there to say? You were both too far gone to care. The weight of loss would settle deeper now, not dramatic or sharp, like in stories, but constant, like a stone in your chest. You'd remember people by the things they left behind: a boot hung on a fence post, a broken knife in a drawer, a song half finished on a banjo string too rusted to play. The dead were never buried with ceremony unless someone nearby had both the time and the sentiment, and both were rarer than gold. Most got a shallow hole and a prayer mumbled through cracked lips, or nothing at all, just left where they fell, dust blowing over their faces until even their features faded. If you'd grown close to someone, an old woman who taught you how to cook beans without burning them, a boy who could carve animals from driftwood, a quiet man who taught you to aim by watching wind patterns, you'd find their absence like a missing limb, aching constantly but invisible to anyone else. And yet, you wouldn't grieve them, not fully. You wouldn't have the strength. Grieving was a kind of luxury you couldn't afford. The fence still needed mending, the coyotes still howled at night, the food still had to last. And if you ever found yourself in one of the bigger frontier towns, places like Dodge City, Tombstone, Deadwood, Cheyenne, you'd learn fast that chaos just wore nicer clothes there. The buildings might be taller, the streets busier, the gambling halls brighter, but beneath it all was the same unspoken rule: everything could change with one drawn gun. There was no safe side of town. One street might host a dance and a sermon in the same night and see a murder before morning. Cattle barons, railroad tycoons, mine owners, they ran the towns like monarchs, their wealth guarded by hired killers and their interests protected by laws they paid to write. Prostitutes were often little more than indentured servants, drugged and beaten, their names lost under nicknames whispered in the dark. And yet they were the ones who saw everything: the deals, the secrets, the deaths. A brothel was sometimes safer than a bank because the women there knew when to keep quiet and when to disappear. And then there were the saloons, where men drank away their last coin, last hope, last trace of decency. The liquor was often mixed with turpentine or creosote, and it might blind you or kill you, but men still drank it because out there, anything was better than feeling too clearly. You might try to hold on to decency, to avoid becoming just another beast in the dust, but you'd find the line harder to see every day. One night you might gamble just to pass the time, the next to win back what you lost, and before long you'd owe the wrong man too much. Then you'd have to leave, disappear into the night, maybe change your name. Everyone changed names eventually. The past followed, and names were its breadcrumbs. Best to burn them all. You'd see lawmen who were more dangerous than the outlaws they hunted, men with tin stars and blood-soaked shirts who shot first and wrote the story later. Some were heroes in the papers but tyrants in person, executing justice with a sneer and a six-shooter. The badge meant nothing without the backing of the town, and if the town feared you, that was enough. You'd learn that many of the so-called famous gunmen were not legends because of skill but because of survival. They shot first, or they had friends who lied well. You'd hear names like Wild Bill, Bat Masterson, Doc Holliday, and the reality would never match the myth. They were gamblers, drunks, sometimes killers. The truth was harder, darker, and more complicated than the dime novels that would one day turn their blood into entertainment. And you, caught in that whirlwind, would realize that history was being written not by the righteous but by the loudest, and you weren't even a whisper. The weather would never be on your side. Summers brought heat that dried your tongue until your mouth cracked and bled. You'd sweat until your clothes stiffened and your skin peeled in layers. You'd dig shallow wells only to find salt water, ride days without a stream, kill a snake for its blood. Winters were worse, winds sharp enough to peel paint, snow that came in sheets and buried cabins overnight. You'd burn books for heat, sleep curled beside your horse, wake up to find your fingers numb, and your breath frozen in your beard. Spring brought mud, floods and disease. Autumn brought dust, dying crops and fire. And yet every year people planted again, built again, bet again. Hope didn't die, it adapted, it grew lean, quiet and cold. It stopped dreaming and started enduring. And the animals, they were smarter than you, more attuned to survival. You'd hear coyotes circling at night, their calls too human to ignore, as if mocking your loneliness. You'd learn to fear the shape of a hawk overhead because it meant your rabbits were gone. You'd wake to find hoofprints in your garden or bear scat outside your window, and you'd know that no fence, no rifle, no plan would keep the wilderness out. It was always watching, always waiting, always taking back what men tried to claim. The land did not want to be tamed. The land was not yours. You were a parasite, a trespasser, and every time you lit a fire, or carved a road, or felled a tree, it was only a matter of time before nature reminded you that out here you were small. A single spark could light a wildfire. A bad decision could get you swept into a ravine. One moment of distraction could end your life, and no one would know. No one would come. No one would find you. And in those final days, if they could still be called that, when you sat by your fire with your back to the wind and your rifle across your knees, you would not be thinking about family or glory or even survival. You would be thinking only of quiet, of stillness, of a moment without threat. And that moment would never come, because even if no one was hunting you, even if your body held, even if the animals stayed away and the weather spared you, you would know that the West itself was not finished with you. It would never be. It would wear you down until there was nothing left, until your name was forgotten, your voice was gone, and your memory faded into the same silence that had claimed millions before you. And that is why you would not survive a day in the Wild West. Not because you would die quickly, but because you would live long enough to become something else, something empty, something the land could swallow without even noticing. Because out there, survival wasn't life. It was surrender, and you were never built for surrender. Not like that, not forever, not in a place where even the mountains seemed to whisper leave or be buried. And when you could no longer walk, no longer see, no longer feel the will to keep trying, you'd lie down beneath that endless sky, and the West would take you to dust, silence to silence. Just another forgotten name in a place that remembered nothing but wind and bone. And even as you lay there, hollow and still, whether on the edge of a canyon where the wind roared like an ancient god, or beneath the brittle boards of a shack long abandoned by its builder, the truth would keep circling your thoughts like a buzzard too patient to land. You would come believing in stories, in grit and glory, in freedom and fortune, but you had stayed long enough to learn that those stories were just bait. No one told the whole truth. No one told you that freedom out here came chained to isolation so vast it could unmake your sense of self. That grit meant scraping your soul raw on days that never gave back. That fortune belonged to those who were willing to drown others for a handful of gold dust. You'd think back to the people who had once survived like you, long ago, settlers who crossed the plains in wagons covered with canvas now rotted to threads in some forgotten ravine, and you'd understand what they must have felt when the axle snapped, when the food spoiled, when their children coughed blood into the firelight, and still they kept moving west, always west, because turning back was worse than whatever lay ahead. But it wasn't nobility that kept them going. It was the simple fact that there was no other choice. And now you knew that same feeling, the slow erosion of hope, the constant bruising from wind and failure and hunger and grief. And you'd realize that this was what the West truly meant. Not cowboys riding into sunsets, but ordinary people being swallowed whole by a land that never asked them to come. If someone found you, and that was a rare thing, they wouldn't know who you were. Maybe they'd see your boots and know you'd walked far. Maybe they'd find something in your pocket, a rusted compass, a waterlogged notebook, a photograph half erased by sweat and time, and they'd wonder what story it told. But they wouldn't ask. They'd take what they needed, your coat if the cold was bad, your knife if theirs had dulled, maybe your horse if it hadn't wandered, and they'd leave you there, not out of cruelty, but because they'd seen too many like you already, and they knew what you had become, a warning, not a tragedy. There were always more. Greenhorns fresh off the train, men with big talk and shiny revolvers, women looking for land and a name of their own. They came and they were eaten, year after year, by thirst, by fire, by loneliness, by the sheer weight of everything being harder than it was supposed to be. Some learnt to survive, fewer learnt to endure, and almost none learnt to remain human through it all. You had not. You might have thought you could, but the Wild West was not a place that allowed your old self to persist. The land was ancient, unmoved by your cleverness or dreams. It gave no sanctuary, only tests, and your failure, if you could call it that, was simply the natural outcome of being human in a place that punished humanity at every turn. Even the ones who called themselves natives to it, the mountain men, the fur trappers, the scouts who could navigate by the stars and disappear into woods for months, were shaped by that same cruelty. They didn't speak of it. Their eyes did. Hard eyes, not cruel but stripped bare of softness. They knew the land was not theirs either, that it tolerated them the way a lion tolerates flies. They spoke of the seasons as if they were living things, hunted their food with a reverence you had long forgotten, slept with their backs to trees and their rifles pointed outward. You once might have admired them, thought them romantic, but now you saw the cost, the solitude, the scarring, the slow retreat from anything that had once resembled a world of warmth or companionship. They belonged to the wild, but not to the world you came from, and if you tried to become one of them, they would not welcome you, not truly. They might share fire, or warn you of a coming storm, but you would always be separate, because they had been broken and rebuilt by the land in ways you had only begun to taste, because they had watched others like you arrive with questions and leave as bones. And so you would come to understand fully and finally that the West didn't want to kill you. It didn't care enough to try. It simply was. It had no interest in your survival, no investment in your story, no awareness of your suffering. It didn't punish, and it didn't reward. It just stood as it always had, vast and patient and silent. The prairie would grow tall again over your tracks. The snow would fall the same, whether you lived or died. The mountains would cast their shadows across graves and towns and rivers without distinction. And maybe, if the wind was right, your last breath would catch a current and drift for miles, until it settled in the dust where another soul once fell, just as lost, just as forgotten. And maybe, somewhere back east, someone would wonder what happened to you. They might wait for a letter that never came, keep a candle in the window, imagine you'd made it big out west, but the truth would be buried with you, and the land would remember none of it. Because in the end, the Wild West was not about the people who came, but about how few of them ever left it the same, and even fewer were remembered. It was a crucible, not a home. A forge that melted down the foolhardy, the brave, the idealistic, the greedy, the desperate, and in the rarest of cases, it hammered something hard and dangerous out of what was left. But you, like most, would be consumed before that alchemy could complete. And so your story, long and slow and full of every aching step, every dry breath, Every moment you told yourself to just keep going would vanish like all the others. One heartbeat lost in a land that had never needed you and never once looked back. And even if some stubborn shard of your mind clung to the illusion that death in the West had meaning, that your passing might inspire a tale, a warning, a ballad hummed by some campfire stranger, you'd eventually realize that not even that solace remained. The West swallowed memory like it did everything else, grinding it down with dust and time, until even the most violent death was reduced to a story with no speaker, a name etched in wood that faded with the sun. There were no tombstones for most, just piles of rocks. If someone cared enough to keep the wolves off your bones, you would not be mourned, not properly, perhaps not at all. For out there, mourning was another risk, another weakness you could not afford. To stop and weep for one meant the rest might be next, so they didn't. They moved on. Even those closest to you would learn the cruel arithmetic of survival. One less mouth, one less body to shelter, one more burden lifted from a trail already too long. And you, even in your final flickers of thought, would understand that this wasn't heartlessness. It was just the way of things, the math of death in a land too wide and hard to carry anything unnecessary, especially grief. You would not be alone in that fate. You'd be surrounded, whether above ground or below, by thousands upon thousands who had come west believing they were exceptions. Teachers, soldiers, mothers, runaways, thinkers, cowards, heroes. They had all arrived in that same dusty hope and been dismantled just the same. Their reasons had been many. Escape, land, gold, adventure, redemption. But in the end, the West treated them equally with indifference. If any lesson endured, it would be that the land you crossed didn't care who you were, not your past, not your dreams, not your prayers. The prairie didn't soften for poets. The canyon made no space for saints, and the desert showed no mercy to those who carried regret like it was armor. You'd come to see this not in a grand revelation, but in the slow, grinding knowledge that you were being forgotten while still breathing. That your story had ended before your body did, and you would feel the ache of that understanding as deeper than hunger, colder than winter, that the world that made you had no place left for what you were becoming. If there had been a family once back east, in some clean house with smooth banisters and oil lamps that glowed without soot, then their images would grow hazy over time, not from lack of love, but from lack of energy. Every ounce of thought you spent on them came at a cost. Missed steps, poor judgment, lowered guard. The land taught you quickly to bury memory beneath urgency. Remembering them would not bring them closer. It would only make the days longer. And so their faces would fade, like photographs left in the sun. You might forget the sound of your mother's voice, the exact hue of your brother's hair. You might forget what you looked like clean-shaven, what it felt like to wear clothes not stiff with sweat and dirt. You'd forget the feeling of certainty, of safety, of walking through streets that didn't require you to scan every corner. And in that forgetting, something within you would curl inward and shrink. A part of you would die long before your body did, and it would die not with a scream but with a sigh, drowned out by wind and silence. There were those who managed to build something out of the West's ruin, not empires but footholds. A fence that held, a cabin that didn't fall, a trade route that lasted a season, but they were exceptions, not rules. For every one of them there were 100 who vanished, their names erased by fire or flood or simple neglect, and the ones who remained did not rejoice in their success. They limped through it. Their victories were measured in seasons without burial, years without starvation, children who lived long enough to speak. They didn't celebrate life, they measured the absence of death. You might have seen one, sitting outside his shack, whittling a stick down to nothing, eyes like driftwood, face carved by weather more than age. You might have wondered what he was thinking, but he wasn't. He was remembering without words, counting ghosts, surviving one more hour because the next was not promised. If he looked at you, it wouldn't be with contempt or pity, it would be with recognition. You were on the same road, only further back. And when your end finally did come, whether with the sound of hooves approaching too fast in the dark, or a fever that boiled your brain in the heat of a July noon, or a simple misstep down a canyon path, it would not be cinematic. There would be no final speech, no slow fade to black, just a sudden silence where you once had been, the world rushing in to fill the space you'd occupied, and the world would not change. The grass would still grow. The sky would still stretch blue and vast and indifferent above the hills. The rivers would still drag their weight through the gullies, wearing stone smooth over decades. And someone might pass that place years later, see nothing but a rusted horseshoe or a torn scrap of canvas, and never know you had been there at all. That was the West's final cruelty. Not that it could kill you, but that it could erase you completely. Not a martyr, not a legend, not even a memory, just another body the land had shrugged off. You could fight it. You could struggle and scream and stake your claims and load your gun and keep moving. And still, the land would win. Because the West didn't need to defeat you, it just needed to outlast you, and it always. So now, if you ask why you wouldn't survive a day in the Wild West, the answer is not in the bullet or the snake or the starvation. It's in the truth that surviving is not living, that to last longer than a day would cost you everything that made you human, that even the strongest, the cleverest, the most hopeful were only borrowing time from a place that took it all back, that the West wasn't won, it was endured, and you, for all your modern wit and resolve, weren't built for enduring that kind of silence, that kind of hunger, that kind of forgetting, because the West didn't just kill the body, it erased the soul, one dust-covered breath at a time.